soldiers we saw on screen were waving flags with excitement and shouting victoriously in the name of the emperor, but their lives were filled with moral dilemmas and misery. Imagine for a moment that you are a Japanese civilian during World War II, and, overnight, you are recruited to fight against the Allied forces. In the blink of an eye, you must leave your life behind and dedicate yourself entirely to a greater cause, for which there are no moral limits or sacrifices too great. Orders are followed, even if they involve massacring innocents, enduring long days without food, or even committing suicide to eliminate the enemy. After a few days, your stomach hardens, not only from lack of food, but from witnessing some of the most unpleasant and inhumane acts of the entire conflict. The worst part is that many of these atrocities are committed by your own hands. In this installment of military history, we want to put you in the shoes of Japanese soldiers to understand in depth what their activities were and what doctrine governed their lives. From the legendary kamikazes, who literally sacrificed themselves for their country, to the soldiers who enjoyed brutalizing prisoners, even to the point of practicing cannibalism. Get ready for an installment that will challenge your moral beliefs and what you thought you knew about the troops of the rising sun. This is how your life would have been if you had fought for Japan during World War II. By mid-1944, Japan was in crisis. Russia and the United States were beginning to encircle it in mainland Asia and in the waters of the Pacific. Meanwhile, its allies in Europe were on the brink of collapse. It was only a matter of time before Italy and the Reich fell under their own weight. In this context, the Japanese Empire embarked on a massive enlistment of between 4 and 6 million people who were sent to different conflict zones. Any man between the ages of 16 and 60 and any woman between the ages of 17 and 40 were eligible to pick up the rifle and defend the interests of the archipelago. You likely would have fallen within the recruitment parameters, regardless of whether you had health problems or were still in school. The only relevant thing for the officers was that you could hold a rifle and obey your superiors. Later on, we'll see how blind obedience was a crucial factor in this army. But first, let's hear the words of Ichiro Koyama, an imperial soldier who survived the war.
何歳の時に兵隊に召集されたんですか？
私は現役兵だから、満20歳。大抵の人はね、5、6万持ってんだけどね、私らみたいにシベリア抑留のあれはね、もうこれはそうなんだね。これは当時の人です。
Studies indicate that almost a quarter of Japan's total population served during World War II in some capacity. As the conflict intensified, many inexperienced recruits were sent to dangerous areas where they lost their lives almost immediately. Now, imagine finding yourself among the millions of soldiers who were enlisted in the final stretch of the war. Beyond military training and firearm preparation, the most important part of your training has to do with the mindset to face the conflict. Since entering the war, American soldiers understood that the Japanese were indoctrinated not even to consider surrendering. Virtually all Japanese units fought until they were annihilated, no matter how much they were disadvantaged compared to the enemy. That's why there were few cases of prisoners surrendering voluntarily to Uncle Sam. If you were to be captured alive, it was better for you if it was due to serious wounds that prevented you from continuing on the battlefield. The vast majority of Japanese prisoners arrived at the prisoner of war camps with diseases or mutilations in their limbs. This was the first thing you had to learn. As a soldier in service to Japan, you were prepared to accept death as just another step in your military career. Surrendering was not acceptable except as an offensive strategy. For example, in some cases, false surrenders were reported with the aim of being able to attack the Allies. Another important factor in being a truly effective Japanese soldier was to fervently despise the enemy. Japanese doctrine indicated that the Empire of the Rising Sun had an almost natural right to dominate Asia. It was their manifest destiny to conquer and subjugate other nationalities in the region. That's why, upon entering the army, you were instructed not to take prisoners. All enemies were to be eliminated, except in some particular occasions that we will detail later. The racism of the Third Reich is synonymous with cruelty during World War II, but Japan's policies were no less cruel. Their foundations were equally fantastical and intolerant, mere justifications for committing genocide against Chinese, Mongolian, and Korean peoples. But these brutal practices were not something that began in World War II. Several years earlier, during the Sino-Japanese battles, Japanese troops were instructed to annihilate any Chinese person who crossed their path.
今のイラクの人もそうだけど、もう抵抗でいるわけじゃないで、いつでも反撃してくるわけでしょ。それに対してこちらまた同じようにね、反撃していくし、いわゆる殲滅作戦をやるわけ。でも日本軍の言うことを聞かないやつはみんなぶっ殺しゃいという考えだからね、非常に乱暴なんですよ。
It didn't matter whether they were civilians or military. In the imperial view, they were an inferior race that could be crushed like a cockroach. That is why, if you were not prepared to torture and eliminate captured enemy soldiers, you were not worthy of wearing the uniform of the rising sun. As we told you, only on certain occasions did Japanese officers consider it appropriate to transport prisoners. Above all, if they were Americans, since the possibility of negotiating with that country to reach an armistice by mutual agreement was being evaluated. That is why many Washington soldiers were captured and sent to concentration camps in Asia. Although they were not shot, the treatment was inhuman and brutal. Both prisoners of war and the civilian population had to suffer unimaginable torment during their stay in Japanese labor camps. The Japanese subjected their victims to long famines, humiliation, slavery, and, on some occasions, being devoured by their captors. The latter is not an exaggeration. During the most brutal periods of the conflict, when supplies were depleted, hunger pushed the Japanese to taste human flesh. Although it was not a widespread practice, there are reports of consumption by enemies, civilians, and even comrades. The mere idea of eating another person's body is disturbing and unpleasant. But within Japanese military doctrine of that time, the end justified the means. It was Professor Yuri Tanaka who in the 1990s exposed cases of cannibalism among Emperor Hirohito's troops. According to the academic, it was a much more common practice than is assumed, since long periods of famine resulted in extreme survival measures. Do you think you would be able to swallow enemies and companions to stay alive? Leave us your answer in the comments box. If your destiny as a soldier was to work in one of the many Japanese detention centers, your experience would not have been very different from that of the members of the SS who operated in the German extermination camps. Day after day, the guards punished and beat the inmates. It is worth highlighting the role of the Buntai Joe, the supervisors of these facilities who were in charge of keeping the prison population in order. To do this, they had an endless repertoire of torture and the most elaborate methods. Keep in mind that only the most ruthless soldiers ever occupied that place. It was the affected survivors who explained several of the cruel punishments inflicted on them. One of these unfortunate men describes how they were forced to drink large quantities of water. Then a Buntai Joe would jump on his stomach until he vomited. Others were left unconscious by inmates with beatings and electric shocks. In this case, we will return to the testimony of Ichiro Koyama for a first-person description of the horror.
まあ一番多いのは拷問だね。拷問かけたりね、拷問かけたのは情報のためにかけるんですよ。バケツに10杯ぐらい水汲んできてね、顔にね、濡れタオルをかけるタオルは。で上からジャブジャブジャブ夜間で水垂らすとね、水膜ができちゃって息が吸えないんですよ。嫌でもう一気に吸おうと思ったらどうもしかないと飲んだ瞬間にパッと水が切れるから息ができるね。何回も繰り返すわけよ。それは苦しいですよ。そんなの何回も崩れたのお腹を金魚のお腹じゃないけどこんなになっちゃってね。そうすると腹の上に乗っかって水吐かせろっつってね、水吐かしてね。でまたやるんですよ。5回も6回も。
While prisoner of war camps were holes of death and torture, no Japanese facility was as infamous as Unit 731. It was a secret scientific base established in Manchuria, where Japanese doctors experimented on humans. in a practice very similar to that of Joseph Mengele, the dreaded surgeon of Auschwitz. Japanese professionals mutilated and poisoned thousands of people. Imagine being a recruit who was called to fight against Western powers. Instead, you are ordered to carry out sickening procedures such as injecting lethal diseases into the bodies of small children. The goal is for you to see how their bodies react to document the infection process. The price to pay is the death of those innocent young ones whose blood is on your hands. We have discussed Unit 731 in detail on this channel. If you want to learn more about it, you can visit some of our videos on the topic. Among the most interesting documents of World War II is the personal diary of a Japanese soldier who fought in the Pacific Theater in the last years of the conflict. The anonymous author was sent to the Gilbert Islands and stationed on Makin Atoll, a small group of territories south of the Marshall Islands. Japan maintained a strong presence in the region as it had established an airbase to prevent Allied advances. It was a fundamental part of the country's defenses, as well as a control point to prevent communication between Hawaii and Australia. That's why, from the American perspective, conquering it was of absolute priority. The Japanese soldiers stationed there experienced moments of great tension and violence defending those lands. This generated depressive feelings and very dark thoughts in the young recruits who, on a daily basis, struggled with the impulse to end their lives. To add to the drama, between November 20th and 23rd, 1943, one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific Theater took place there, being a crushing defeat for the Japanese. Out of a total of 800 men, combining soldiers and workers, 395 died, while another 146 were taken as prisoners. On November 25th, 1943, just a few days after these violent events, the owner of the diary wrote these harsh words on its pages. "Although we are alive, we believe we will last only 2 or 3 days. Each of us has placed the gun barrel in our throat multiple times, but we will die soon, so why not just carry on to the end?" It's not difficult to understand the pessimistic view of the anonymous author. Imagine waking up day after day to the shouts of your superiors to defend that small floating rock. Each day could be the last, as you know well that beyond the horizon, some of the best prepared soldiers on the planet await. Furthermore, the battles of November were a disaster, and most of your comrades are dead or captured, leaving you only to wait your turn in deplorable conditions. Little rest, scant food, and the feeling that everything has been lost for months on end. As a soldier in the service of the Empire of Japan, your priority is to defend the interests of the archipelago, even if it demands sacrificing your own life. Being captured, or, worse yet, surrendering to the enemy, is a sign of cowardice and weakness, the two worst characteristics a man can have. Although it was never officially announced, the Japanese government declared during World War II that any prisoner of war captured by the Allies could expect the death penalty upon returning home. This forces your comrades and you to fight beyond your physical capabilities. Propaganda plays a fundamental role in how troops confront the challenges of war. As for Japan, they made effective use of these tools, alleging that atrocities and mistreatment of all kinds were committed in the United States prison camps. According to reports from the Army Intelligence Agency, Japanese officers told their men about the cases of extreme violence to which the detainees were subjected. One of the most common rumors was that Washington soldiers enjoyed cutting off the noses, ears, and penises of captured enemies. They didn't kill them, they mutilated them, and then sent them to the hospital to recover. The goal was to return them to their homeland as destroyed men, without manhood or honor. Again, we turn to the words of the author of that anonymous diary found in Makin. "We pay our respects at the place where the commander died. We had about 20 hand grenades. We waited all day, but we didn't see the enemy. We heard gunshots from all directions. Our spirits rose. Today, we filled ourselves with chocolate, meat, sugar, and bread that was left by the enemy. The whole day passed, and we didn't see anyone, neither rivals nor friends. The Japanese soldier's narrative is messy and segmented, but it portrays in a few words a day in the archipelago. War is not only made up of brutal confrontations, but also of long periods of waiting, in silence, waiting for the moment of action to present itself. It is in these periods where men's temperance and courage are tested. As American tanks and infantry swept through Makin searching for survivors, the Allies also began work on an airport. The airbase was quickly equipped for 5,000 men and 75 ships. Instead, the Japanese who were still alive built canoes and rustic rafts to flee to other islands in the archipelago. Imagine finding yourself in that terrible situation, fleeing from a powerful enemy aboard unstable timbers in the cold waters of the Pacific. If it's difficult for you to enter the mind of a simple soldier, even more incomprehensible were the legendary kamikazes, those pilots who gave their lives by crashing into high-priority targets. Basically, it was turning suicide into a weapon of war. To this day, the functioning of these units and the level of conviction of their members are subject to analysis. On May 10, 1945, at Chiran Air Base in Kyushu, kamikaze pilot Haruo Araki wrote a letter to his wife before embarking on his final mission. "Shigeko, are you okay? It's been a month since that day. The happy dream is over. Tomorrow, I will crash my plane into an enemy ship. I will cross the river to the afterlife, taking some Yankees with me. When I look back, I see that I was very harsh with you. After being cruel to you, I always regretted it. Please forgive me." These are the words of a man convinced of giving his life for a higher cause. The next day at 6 a.m., the pilot took off in one of the 150 planes that were part of the 6th mass suicide attack against the Allied fleet in Okinawa. The kamikaze unit was a last-minute measure. If you were part of that team, you were part of a desperate attempt to prevent the arrival of the Americans. Suicide attacks began in 1944 and ceased with Japan's unconditional surrender. What is surprising is how thousands of young men were convinced to crash their aircraft into the enemy, abandoning their families, as Haruo Araki recounts in his letter. This was largely due to the state Shintoism that had been taught in the archipelago for years. It was a mix of religion and emperor worship, placing him in a divine position. From that perspective, no sacrifice was too great to sustain his glory. Imagine being aboard one of the small imperial aircraft, crossing the waters of the Pacific with a clear objective: to destroy an Allied ship. You know that to do so, you have to die in a horrific explosion. But fleeing is not an option. Of all the betrayals to Imperial Japan, escaping from a kamikaze mission is the worst of all, as your family would suffer the consequences of your cowardice. As you approach your target, you understand that things are not going to be so simple. On the other side, there are thousands of armed sailors trying to shoot you down to save themselves. During that year of operation between 1944 and 1945, 2,600 attacks of this type were recorded, with a cost of over 4,000 Japanese lives and 7,000 Allied lives. The work of the kamikazes is one of the most incredible facets of the Japanese experience during World War II. Both the testimonies of American prisoners and the words written in letters and diaries are tools to build a complex mosaic. The life of a Japanese soldier cannot be described in a few words. During World War II, they were portrayed as ruthless beasts who only thought about eliminating the enemy. But the truth is that a large part of their armed forces consisted of simple farmers forcibly recruited. Of course, there were also entire units that enjoyed causing harm to their victims. The Japanese doctrine was effective in educating soldiers who believed themselves racially and culturally superior, justifying any type of crime committed. What we can assure you is that the careers of most of these men were extremely short. They were trained to give their lives to the cause, and that's how millions died fighting or even committing suicide as kamikazes. Being a recruit in the Japanese army, your life was completely at the service of a great war machine. All your days were dedicated to a conflict that your superiors knew was lost, but they were still willing to fight. Knowing this, do you think you could have survived World War II fighting for the Japanese side? Leave us your answer in the comments section. This is how we reach the end of the video. If you like this type of content and want to learn more about the fronts of World War II, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications. This way, you can stay informed of all our news. Without further ado, we bid you farewell until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.